During the next meal you eat, take a good look at the food on your plate. Just by looking at it, do you think you could tell if the food is all natural or has been modified in some way? One way that food is modified is through genetic engineering. Genetic engineering is when the genetic makeup of an organism is altered by inserting, deleting, or changing specific pieces of DNA. When conducting genetic engineering, the organisms that have their genetic makeup altered are referred to as genetically modified organisms, or GMOs for short. During the process of genetic engineering, a piece or several pieces of DNA are altered to change a characteristic about the organism. If DNA is inserted, it can come from another individual with the desired characteristic, it can come from a different species, or it could be artificially produced. Over the years, genetic engineering has become more common in agriculture. Globally, there are over 25 countries that grow genetically engineered crops on approximately 420 million acres of land, and those numbers are increasing every year. The United States is responsible for producing almost half of the genetically engineered crops planted worldwide, and currently devotes over 40% of U.S. cropland to these modified crops. Although many crops have been genetically engineered over the years, there are 3 crops, corn, soybean, and cotton, that are the focus of genetic engineering. In the United States, about 80% of corn and cotton, and 93% of soybeans that are produced, are genetically modified. There is a wide variety of types of genetic engineering used in agriculture. One of the most common types of genetic engineering is to insert the genes from bacteria into the crop. This type of genetic engineering works like an insecticide, which is a pesticide that targets unwanted insects, because when the insects consume the crop, they will be infected by the bacteria and will get sick and eventually die. Another common type of genetic engineering is when genes for herbicide resistance are inserted into crops. When herbicides, which are pesticides that target unwanted plants, are sprayed on the field, the weeds will be killed while the crops survive due to the insertion of the resistant genes. In addition to these common types of genetic engineering, agricultural crops are also modified to resist diseases and produce crops that have higher protein concentrations, higher levels of vitamins and minerals, and delayed fruit ripening. The use of genetic engineering and the creation of genetically modified crops has resulted in many benefits for the agricultural world. The most noticeable benefit is that genetic engineering has made it possible to produce more crops in a shorter time period. Due to the modifications that make crops resistant to diseases, it has been possible to increase overall yields. Many genetically modified crops are also designed to grow at a faster rate, which also helps increase overall yield. Genetic engineering has also increased yield by making it possible to grow crops in regions that would otherwise be unsuitable for agriculture, such as areas with salty soil, areas that are drought-prone, and areas with low amounts of sunlight. Through genetic engineering, crops have been modified to tolerate salty soils, be more drought-resistant, and increase their rate of photosynthesis to take advantage of limited sunlight. In addition to increasing productivity, genetic engineering has had several other benefits to agriculture. By modifying crops so that they are resistant to diseases and insects, less chemical pesticides have to be used to combat diseases and pests. Also, if crops are genetically modified to include components of fertilizers, less chemical fertilizers have to be placed on the fields. By reducing the amount of chemical pesticides and fertilizers, there will be less harm done to the environment. Genetic engineering has also made it possible to produce new varieties of crops by mixing genes from multiple different species. Although there are many benefits of genetically engineered crops, there are also some major issues and concerns associated with these types of crops. One major concern is that as pests experience constant exposure to the pesticide or herbicide that is genetically inserted into the crops, they will develop genetic resistance to the chemical. If the pests develop genetic resistance, eventually the genetically modified crops would no longer be successful at preventing harm and would become obsolete. Another major concern about genetic engineering is the long-term effects on human health and the environment. There is little known about the long-term effects of genetically engineered crops, and this makes many people cautious about their use. In terms of human health, there are concerns that genetically engineered crops could contain harmful toxins if the cells mutate, that produce may be lower in nutrition, and that the creation of novel varieties of crops could lead to the development of new and unknown food allergies. In terms of the potential harm to the environment, there is concern that once genetically modified organisms are released into the wild, they cannot be controlled, and they could cause harm to the natural ecosystem. The genetically modified organisms could potentially outcompete native non-pest organisms or prey on non-pest organisms. These new organisms could also interbreed with native organisms and create new species that may not be desirable. Now, let's review the basics of genetic engineering and the benefits and issues associated with its use in agriculture. Genetic engineering is when the genetic makeup of an organism is altered by inserting, deleting, or changing specific pieces of DNA. This results in the creation of genetically modified organisms, which are organisms that have their genetic makeup altered. The use of genetic engineering has become very popular in agriculture, with large portions of common crops produced in the United States and worldwide utilizing this technology. Genetic engineering has made it possible to produce more crops by making plants resistant to diseases, increasing growth rates, and modifying plants so that they can grow in less suitable habitats. Another benefit of genetic engineering is that it has reduced the amount of chemical pesticides and fertilizers used because the modified plants are designed to produce those materials themselves. Genetic engineering has also made it possible to produce new varieties of crops and potentially expand dietary variation. Although there have been many benefits to genetic engineering, there are also numerous issues associated with it. Overall, people are concerned about the long-term effects of genetically modified crops on human health and the environment. There is concern that these new organisms may introduce harmful toxins into the human body or create new allergies. On the environmental side, there is concern that new organisms could alter the natural ecosystem by causing harm to non-pest organisms and spreading their genes through interbreeding. In addition to these concerns, it is also possible that pests develop genetic resistance to the genetically modified organisms, and new crops would have to be designed. As you can now see, the topic of genetic engineering in agriculture is a very complex argument. Although genetic engineering has made it possible to increase food production and improve global food security, the concerns about this technology are serious and must be addressed. In order to learn more about the potential harm of genetically modified organisms, long-term experiments and testing need to be conducted. Scientists also need to work to develop new and safer methods of food production. Unfortunately, the production of genetically modified organisms is not going to stop while scientists test the safety of these crops and discover new production methods. So scientists need to work fast, and governments need to establish strict regulations on these types of crops to control their use and prevent any future harm.